Years later, we struggle with the same ethical questions, we have the same moral difficulties, and I think that's one of the reasons that this show is timeless, because we struggle with the same things today that they struggled with. And to have presented this in such a creative way and an imaginative setting was the perfect blend.
I got into a debate online for the show called Just Seen. It's a movie review series, but they wanted to do a Star Trek versus Star Wars debate. So of course I was picked to defend and speak for Star Trek. So me and this guy Kevin was a Star Wars guy, went on for about 9 or 10 minutes. Star Trek versus Star Wars. You're saying, oh, well, Star Wars made all this money, you got all these people running around with Jedi, all this stuff, all this garbage. So I said, hang on a minute. Star Trek was about something. Star Trek had something to say. Star Trek was philosophical. And how many of the best Star Trek episodes serve as allegories for not those times, but for our times now, why they still endure. Like you watch an episode like Balance of Terror, which was a take on the Cold War, on Vietnam, could easily be a take on what's going on like in Iraq and Afghanistan too. That's why an episode like that still holds up. And within that episode, as if it wasn't enough that they were dealing with the Romulans, you have a navigator who is totally a red-blooded bigot. And I love that scene on the bridge when Kirk says, leave any bigotry in your quarters, there's no room for it here on the bridge. It's a great scene. But stuff like that, that is why I think what you're saying, why Star Trek holds up so well. But I just love asking this question, when push comes to shove, hands down, of any of the Star Trek shows, including, yes, the animated series, what is your favorite single Star Trek episode? Single favorite. Not like, oh, I like this and this and this. What's one?
It's a cliche, sitting in the edge of forever.
But it's a good cliche. Why?
That's the most powerful episode they ever did, and you got to see Kirk torn apart emotionally in a way we've never saw before or since.
Just that last scene when they come back through the Guardian, and they're all happy. Oh, they're back, and who's back too? But the look on Kirk's face with his jaw clenched, and let's get the hell out of here.
First swear word on television, I believe.
Yes.
When Flora said the Enterprise is up there calling, they want to know if we want to beam up, and Kirk said, let's get the hell out of here. Yeah.
Chase Masterson, what is yours?
I think it would have to be Dr. Bashir in this movie because I got to kiss up a Randy.
That's a good one.
Yeah, Rich Thompson. I love the movie series really, and each of the series has its own personality, so they're
It does have so that's what's great about it.
it's hard to choose.
And I love how Deep Space Nine did its own thing. It was like a flip of Star Trek, and this really hit its stride. Where the original show like died in its third season, DS9 really hit its stride in its third season. So it's great about Deep Space Nine. I love it.
I don't know that it died. The original series died in this series?
Well, did you see Spock's brain? Did you see And the Children Shall Lead? Did you see The Way to Eden? Oh! But they did have the Holy Breath. Without you, David.
Well, first, you for making us reduce it to just one out of 700. I'll go with Deep Space Nine, The Visitor. Just because it's such a hard love between a father and a son. A father who in the beginning is going to sacrifice himself for the son, and then the son gives himself to the father. It's beautiful.
Beautiful.
Listen, don't laugh, okay? Hey.
I can't remember.
The Way to Eden was my favorite. My favorite episode was Requiem for Methuselah.
I hate that.
From the third season. Who said that?
I did.
Dan, you said.
Oh, we're gonna have to talk. Go ahead.
You know what? I'm gonna win you over. And you know what it was about it was the last 3 minutes when Raina collapses because she can't deal with, she's not ready to deal with the contradictions of loving someone as a father and loving someone as a lover and having to choose between them. And it just tears her apart. And those lines at the end of that episode, I mean, when she falls down and Kirk looks up at Spock and says, "What happened?" And Spock says, "She loved you, Captain." And you too, Mr. Flint, as a mentor, even as a father. There wasn't enough time for her to reconcile the awful contradictions of her newfound emotions. She couldn't bear to hurt either of you. The joys of love made her human, and the agonies of love destroyed her. And I just started sobbing. And then in the last scene in Kirk's quarters, Kirk is sitting there feeling humiliated about his behavior. When do we ever see Kirk sitting there going, we put on a pretty poor show today? He was embarrassed by the way he behaved. If only I could forget. And McCoy, some of the best lines that McCoy ever said. When he says to Spock, Kirk falls asleep and he says, you know, Spock, I feel sorrier for you than I do for him. Because you'll never know the things love can drive a man to. The desperate chances, the glorious failures, the glorious victories. All these things you'll never know simply because your love isn't into your book.
Should we just put the DVD on?
It's so beautiful. The Trek is wonderful in that way. It shows you the complete flip side of the character. And on the flip side of that, when Bill Ducott lost his daughter in Seattle in Sacrifice of Angels, and you see this man who you hated, but you see him in such agony, and you see the human side of him, and you realize that war has so many faces and that no one is ever a winner, and that you wouldn't wish that kind of grief even on your worst enemy. You know, it's all of those things where you see the other side of someone, and so it becomes like there is no them, there's only us, and we can identify with everyone, even people.
And these scenes could take place anywhere.
Yeah,
That's the
and they
beauty of
do.
it. It just happens to be on a starship. It could happen anywhere to any human being anywhere. What does God
It happens all the time.
Excuse me.
Finding the humanity in all this characters.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's why, again, light
Our enemy.
And it's about us learning to see ourselves in each other, you know, in people who seem vastly different from us at the beginning, and learning to find that common thread of existence that ties us all together.
I think Vic needs a tissue. Are you okay?
My favorite Star Trek episode. Listen, I love Mirror Mirror, Doomsday Machine sitting in the edge of her, Lock Time Down Terror, as much as the next Trek. But my personal favorite is an episode from the second season that was written by the man who, listen, Gene Roddenberry created the show. He gave birth to it, he evolved it. But the writer-producer who took Star Trek and made it better was Gene Coon. Gene Coon is the unsung hero of Star Trek. And the best of Coon is evident in Metamorphosis. Because that episode, it's the most sensitive and intimate episode. It's one of the most beautiful and moving of the whole series of any of the Star Treks, any of the Star Trek shows. And for the first half, when they think the companion is a monster, Kirk is supposed to get off the planet and head her back to the Enterprise so they can treat her and she can go fight her war. And then the moment, using a device that looked a lot like this, the Universal Translator, when they hear that the companion is a woman, it flips the episode completely over and it turns into a tender, beautifully told love story. A love story that defies physical appearance. And the way Kirk tries to reason with the companion, I think, is some of the finest acting that Wade Shatner did in all of Star Trek. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful episode.
And the music score to that episode was beyond.
George Clooney's musical score is gorgeous. Absolutely hands down. But the question is, now here we are, Star Trek is 50 years old. We've now had 2 movies in the last 5 years that have really, in all the right ways, opened Star Trek to people who might not even like Star Trek. When the 2009 film came out, I reviewed it and I said it was a Star Trek movie for people who don't like Star Trek. Like my mom liked that movie, and she does not like Star Trek. But I really loved the 2009 movie more than Into Darkness. I mean, when Spock yelled Khan, I cringed in my freaking seat. You do not remake Wrath of Khan. You do not remake Citizen Kane. did not remake Set sorry. But the question is now, the guy, people are calling, oh, Star Trek 3 is coming out in 2016. I'm sorry, there was a Star Trek 3. It's called The Search for Spock, and it came out on June 2nd of 1984. It's okay. We know that there's a Star Trek movie in the works. But where do you think Star Trek should go after that? It can't just be movies. How many of you agree with me that Star Trek belongs on television? Where do you think is the most logical step, no pun intended, for Star Trek to go?
Captain Stole an answer back on television. I would ideally like to see Star Trek, the third one, comes out, to see that crew of the Enterprise, obviously with new actors, back on television and continuing the voyages, basically. From that point forward, that would be my idea for the future Star Trek.
Chase Masterson.
I agree that Star Trek belongs on television, largely because of the intimacy that happens when stories appear in your living room. You get to have that as part of your home, and there's a relaxedness there that you don't have when you're in the theater. And I think the stories are so beautifully absorbed. And it's kind of like a mystery. We're the people, the storytellers, or the actors, we're the people that get to lead an audience into laughing or crying or hugging your children or writing that letter or seeing the world in a more dimensional, just a more thorough atmosphere. So I agree that it should be on television for that reason. I think it would be really interesting to do a Section 31 series. Showing, and I've heard that a couple of times, I think that showing the lighter and darker side of heroism and the fact that your enemy is not always so one-dimensional, and again, that there is no them, there's only us, there are so many different sides to stories, I think is a very Star Trek thing. Just the diversity that you could play into that, especially in these times of tumultuous stuff I'm stuttering here, but anything that's going on in the Middle East and our own country, there's so much need for an understanding of what we perceive to be the other. And isn't that what Star Trek is about?
Absolutely.
It's about getting each other to
the next time.
I agree that Star Trek needs to be back on television because A, that's where it started, and it's always been ideally suited to a television format. It's about people who have a job, who have a mission. And movies, I think, although they are fun, they're big, they have spectacle, I don't think they've served Star Trek very well in all cases because they do tend to reduce stories to spectacle and often to binary issues, whereas Star Trek on television was able to examine much more complex ideas over a much longer period of time. Where I will disagree with you is I don't think a Section 31 series would necessarily be the best way to go because I think Section 31 is kind of like the preview. You want a little bit of spice, but you don't want that to be the whole meal. I think it would be a little bit dark, and I don't think it represents the best of what Star Trek is about. I think that a new Star Trek series would be very difficult to do with a movie cast just for budgetary reasons. But I think that